November 14th, 1982. The fluorescent lights of St. Vincent Hospital's pediatric ward cast long shadows across the empty corridor. Sarah Mitchell made her final rounds, checking on sleeping children one last time. Room 304, a little boy with pneumonia, breathing steadily. Room 308, a girl recovering from appendectomy, peaceful. 11:32 p.m. Sarah signed out at the nurse's station, smiled at the night shift arriving, grabbed her coat, and walked toward the employee exit. She would never walk through those doors again. At 29 years old, Sarah Mitchell represented everything a pediatric nurse should be. Her colleagues described her as the person who remembered every child's name, who stayed late to comfort frightened parents, who decorated the ward with hand-drawn cartoon characters to make the sterile environment less intimidating. The children called her Nurse Sarah, and many refused treatment from anyone else. She had wavy brown hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, warm hazel eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and a seemingly endless supply of patience that made even the most difficult shifts manageable. That Sunday evening shift had been routine. Sarah had clocked in at 3:00 p.m., relieving the day nurse with her characteristic efficiency. The ward held 11 young patients, ranging from a 3-year-old with croup to a 14-year-old recovering from a broken femur. Sarah moved between rooms with practiced ease, administering medications, changing IV bags, documenting vital signs in careful handwriting that filled page after page of patient charts. She ate dinner in the break room at 7:30 p.m., a sandwich from home and an apple, chatting with respiratory therapist Linda Morrison about their plans for Thanksgiving. Nothing about the evening suggested danger. No unusual visitors had been noted. No concerning incidents occurred on the ward. Security logs showed normal activity throughout the hospital. Sarah finished her documentation at 11:28 p.m., 4 minutes ahead of schedule. She updated the night shift on each patient's status, made a joke about the coffee being particularly terrible that evening, and headed to the locker room to retrieve her belongings. Before we continue with what happened next, take a moment to subscribe to Uncovered Crime Archive. This channel explores cold cases that haunted communities for decades before finally finding answers. Cases like Sarah's prove that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still arrive even when hope seems lost. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these extraordinary stories of persistence and truth. At 11:36 p.m., security camera footage from the hospital's rear entrance captured Sarah pushing open the heavy metal door. She wore her navy blue winter coat over her scrubs, a cream-colored knit scarf wrapped twice around her neck, and carried a brown leather purse over her right shoulder. The footage, grainy and black and white, showed her pause briefly to button her coat against the November cold before stepping into the employee parking lot. The temperature that night hovered just above freezing. A light wind carried the scent of approaching winter across Green Bay. The parking lot, illuminated by 6 sodium vapor lamps, held perhaps 24 vehicles scattered across spaces marked for over 100. Most belonged to night shift staff who wouldn't leave until morning. Sarah's 1979 Honda Accord sat in its usual spot, 3rd row from the building, directly beneath a lamppost. She'd parked there for the past 7 years, ever since accepting her position at St. Vincent. The security camera's field of view ended approximately 30 feet from the exit door. Beyond that point, the parking lot stretched into darkness, punctuated by pools of yellow light. Sarah walked confidently into that darkness, her figure growing smaller as she moved away from the camera's lens. At 11:37 p.m. and 18 seconds, she disappeared from view entirely. The camera continued recording the empty doorway, the falling leaves dancing in the wind, the unchanging scene. But Sarah Mitchell never appeared on any camera again. At 2:14 a.m., Security guard Thomas Reynolds conducted his routine patrol of the facility grounds. He drove slowly through the employee lot in his white pickup truck, checking for any irregularities. That's when he noticed vehicle number 43 in his mental count, a brown Honda Accord with its engine still running. Steam rose from the exhaust pipe into the cold air. The driver's side door hung open at an odd angle. Reynolds pulled alongside the vehicle and aimed his flashlight through the open door. The interior light illuminated an empty driver's seat. A brown leather purse sat on the passenger seat, undisturbed. The keys remained in the ignition, the engine humming steadily. On the dashboard, he spotted a hospital identification badge with a photograph of a smiling young woman. The name read, Sarah Mitchell, RN, Pediatrics. Something about the scene felt profoundly wrong. The running engine, the open door, the abandoned purse. Reynolds had worked security for 16 years and developed instincts about these things. He reached for his radio with a hand that had begun to tremble slightly. His voice, when he spoke, carried an edge of concern that would prove entirely justified. Central, this is Reynolds. I've got a situation in employee lot C. Need a supervisor and possibly police. We might have a missing nurse. Within minutes, the scene transformed. Hospital security supervisor Margaret Chen arrived first, followed quickly by Green Bay Police Department officers, responding to what initially seemed like a possible medical emergency or accident. By 2:45 a.m., Detective James Thornton stood in the parking lot, his notebook already filling with observations that would become the foundation of an investigation spanning more than 4 decades. The Honda's engine had consumed most of its fuel by the time officers arrived. They turned off the ignition and began processing what had suddenly become a potential crime scene. Sarah's purse yielded immediate clues to her identity, but raised more questions than it answered. Inside, investigators found her wallet containing $43 in cash, 3 credit cards, her driver's license, and a photograph of her parents standing in front of their home in Appleton. There was a tube of chapstick, a pack of spearmint gum, a small notepad with a grocery list, and her car keys on a keychain shaped like a stethoscope. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing seemed taken. The purse looked exactly as it should if someone had simply set it down for a moment, intending to return. Detective Thornton expanded the search perimeter immediately. Officers combed the parking lot with flashlights, examining every shadow, every potential hiding place. They checked behind dumpsters, inside unlocked vehicles, around the perimeter fence that bordered the hospital property. A K-9 unit arrived at 3:30 a.m., and the German Shepherd picked up Sarah's scent from her coat in the vehicle, followed it approximately 60 feet into the parking lot, then stopped abruptly near a drainage grate. The dog circled the area repeatedly, whining in confusion. The trail simply ended. By dawn, Sarah's parents, Robert and Margaret Mitchell, sat in a sterile conference room at Green Bay Police Department headquarters, their faces painted with the particular terror that comes from receiving a middle-of-the-night phone call about their child. Robert, a 54-year-old postal worker, kept checking his watch as if time itself might provide answers. Margaret, a high school English teacher, clutched a recent photograph of Sarah, taken at Thanksgiving the previous year. "She calls every Sunday after her shift," Margaret told Detective Thornton, her voice steady despite obvious distress. "Every single Sunday for 7 years. She gets home around midnight, makes herself tea, and calls to tell me about her week. When the phone didn't ring last night, I knew something was wrong, but I told myself, maybe she was just tired. Maybe she went straight to bed." Her hands trembled as she placed the photograph on the table between them. "I should have called the hospital. I should have checked." The detective assured her that nothing she could have done would have changed what happened. But the guilt parents carry in these situations defies logic. Margaret Mitchell would spend the next 42 years wondering if that phone call might have made a difference, even though the timeline would eventually prove that Sarah had already vanished before her mother even noticed the missed call. Sarah's apartment in downtown Green Bay offered few insights. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom unit above a bakery on Cherry Street. The apartment was neat, organized, filled with medical textbooks and framed photographs of children she'd cared for over the years, their thank you cards covering an entire wall like a paper quilt of gratitude. Her bed was made. Dishes sat clean in the drying rack. A calendar on her refrigerator showed appointments for the coming weeks, including a dental cleaning on November 22nd, and dinner plans with friends on Thanksgiving. Everything suggested a woman who expected to return to her normal life. Nothing hinted at someone planning to disappear. Detective Thornton noted the milk in her refrigerator, fresh with an expiration date 2 weeks away. The plants on her windowsill showed regular watering. A library book sat on her nightstand, bookmark placed at page 147. These were not the details of a life being abandoned. The hospital staff interviews painted a consistent portrait. Sarah Mitchell was universally loved, professionally competent, personally kind. Not a single co-worker reported any concerning behavior, no unusual conversations, no hints of trouble in her life. Charge nurse Patricia Donovan, who had worked the 3-hour round to 11 Tylenol p.m. shift alongside Sarah for 5 years, struggled to maintain her composure during questioning. She talked about wanting to adopt a dog. Patricia remembered, tears streaming down her face. She'd been looking at the shelter, thinking maybe a small terrier mix. She said once she saved enough for a deposit on a house with a yard, she'd finally do it. That was her big dream, a little house with a yard and a dog. Patricia's voice broke. You don't make plans like that if you're going to vanish. Dr. Robert Garrison, Chief of Pediatrics, appeared at the police station voluntarily on Monday morning to provide his statement. At 46 years old, he was a distinguished figure in Green Bay's medical community, known for his expertise in childhood respiratory diseases and his dedication to his young patients. He'd worked at St. Vincent Hospital for 12 years, overseeing the pediatric department with what colleagues described as genuine passion for improving children's health care. Sarah was exceptional, Dr. Garrison told investigators, his expression grave. The kind of nurse who makes everyone around her better at their jobs. The children trusted her implicitly. Parents requested her specifically. Losing her is devastating for this hospital and this community. He paused, seeming to gather himself emotionally. I've already spoken with our administration about establishing a search fund. Whatever resources you need, Detective, the hospital will provide them. True to his word, Dr. Garrison mobilized St. Vincent's resources immediately. By Tuesday morning, hospital staff had organized volunteer search parties. Over 300 people combed through Green Bay's parks, wooded areas, and waterfront properties. They searched abandoned buildings, checked bridges, walked the shores of the bay, calling Sarah's name until their voices grew hoarse. The initial investigation consumed massive resources. Green Bay Police Department deployed every available detective to the case. The FBI field office in Milwaukee sent specialists in missing persons cases. Bloodhounds tracked scents through the hospital grounds. Divers searched the Fox River. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over surrounding areas. Every lead, no matter how seemingly insignificant, received thorough investigation. A gas station attendant reported seeing a woman matching Sarah's description at a rest stop 30 miles north of Green Bay around 1:00 a.m. that night. Police spent 2 days tracking down that lead, only to discover the woman was a traveling sales representative with ironclad documentation of her identity. A psychic from Chicago contacted investigators, claiming visions of Sarah near water and tall trees, a description vague enough to match dozens of locations in Wisconsin. Another caller insisted they'd seen Sarah boarding a bus to Minneapolis. None of these leads produced evidence. The most promising development came 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance. A construction worker renovating a warehouse 2 miles from the hospital discovered a navy blue winter coat abandoned in a corner of the building. The coat matched the description of what Sarah had been wearing. Evidence technicians examined every fiber, every pocket, every stitch, but the coat belonged to someone else entirely, a homeless woman who'd been staying in the warehouse and had left it behind when police presence in the area intensified during the search. By January 1983, the active search phase concluded. Police had exhausted immediate leads, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, processed countless pieces of potential evidence. Detective Thornton maintained the investigation as open and active, but resources necessarily shifted to other cases. The reality of police work meant that without new evidence, without witnesses, without a body, the investigation could only pursue so many dead ends before practical limitations intervened. Sarah's family refused to accept this transition. Robert Mitchell reduced his hours at the post office to dedicate time to searching. He created missing person flyers and distributed them throughout Wisconsin, then expanded to neighboring states. Margaret took a leave of absence from teaching to coordinate volunteer efforts. They established a dedicated phone line for tips, operated from their home, answered personally at all hours. The hope that sustained them through those early months gradually transformed into grim determination that would define the rest of their lives. Dr. Robert Garrison emerged as one of the Mitchell family's most steadfast supporters. In March 1983, he organized a fundraiser at St. Vincent Hospital that raised $12,000 for the family's search efforts. He established the Sarah Mitchell Memorial Scholarship, providing financial assistance to nursing students specializing in pediatric care. Each year on November 14th, he led a candlelight vigil in the hospital parking lot where Sarah was last seen, speaking movingly about her dedication and the void her absence created. Sarah represented the best of what healthcare can be, Dr. Garrison said at the first anniversary vigil, his voice thick with emotion as 200 people held candles against the November wind. Her compassion, her skill, her unwavering commitment to these children. We honor her memory not just with words but with action. Every nurse we help through this scholarship, every child we heal in this hospital, carries forward her legacy. If this investigation is fascinating you, take a moment to like this video. Your engagement helps others discover these important stories, cases that remind us why we must never stop searching for truth, no matter how many years pass. By 1985, media coverage had largely ceased. The story that once dominated local news became an occasional update, then an annual remembrance piece on the anniversary, then finally silence. Other tragedies, other crimes, other headlines claimed public attention. For most people in Green Bay, Sarah Mitchell's name became a sad story from the past, referenced in conversations about hospital safety or unsolved mysteries, but no longer generating active concern. The Mitchell family's universe contracted around their loss. Robert and Margaret's marriage strained under the weight of unanswered questions and endless grief. They attended support groups for families of missing persons, but found little comfort in shared pain. Robert developed a detailed filing system tracking every piece of information about Sarah's case, every police report, every witness statement, every theory. The spare bedroom of their Appleton home transformed into a command center, walls covered with maps and timelines and photographs. Margaret channeled her anguish into advocacy, working with Wisconsin legislators to improve protocols for missing persons investigations. She testified before committees, sharing Sarah's story as evidence for the need for better coordination between jurisdictions and faster response times. Some of her efforts resulted in policy changes, small victories that provided purpose, even as they couldn't provide the one answer she desperately needed. Detective Thornton retired in 1994, 12 years after Sarah vanished. He handed the case file to Detective Linda Carlson with a heavy heart, knowing it represented his greatest professional failure. "I followed every lead," he told Carlson during the transfer meeting, his weathered hands resting on 3 thick binders of documentation. "I worked this case as hard as any in my career. But sometimes, the answers just aren't there to find." Carlson inherited dozens of cold cases, but Sarah Mitchell's file stood out. Perhaps it was the meticulous documentation Thornton had maintained. Perhaps it was the Mitchell family's refusal to let the case fade. Or perhaps it was the fundamental wrongness of a young nurse vanishing from a hospital parking lot without a trace. Carlson reviewed the case annually, hoping advances in forensic science might offer new approaches. The cardboard evidence box sat on a metal shelf in the Green Bay Police Department's evidence warehouse for 42 years. Inside, sealed in plastic bags, were the items recovered from Sarah Mitchell's abandoned Honda Accord on that November night in 1982. Her brown leather purse, her wallet and identification, her car keys, and item number 7 in the evidence log, one silver stethoscope with a small purple heart sticker, found on the asphalt near the driver's side door. In October 2024, the Wisconsin Cold Case Initiative received federal funding to apply cutting-edge forensic technologies to unsolved cases from the 1980s. Detective Rachel Morrison, newly assigned to the specialized unit, selected Sarah Mitchell's disappearance as one of her first cases to review. Something about the abandoned car, the running engine, the inexplicable vanishing drew her attention. She requested the evidence box from storage and began the painstaking process of re-examination. Modern forensic science had evolved dramatically since 1982. Techniques that didn't exist when Sarah vanished now offered possibilities that seemed almost miraculous. Touch DNA analysis could extract genetic material from skin cells left on objects through casual contact. Advanced mass spectrometry could identify chemical compounds at molecular levels. Digital enhancement could reveal details in photographs invisible to investigators decades earlier. Detective Morrison focused particularly on the stethoscope. In 1982, it had been photographed, briefly examined for fingerprints, which proved too smudged to identify, then sealed away. The investigators at the time noted it in their reports, but considered it primarily significant as confirmation that Sarah had dropped something in the parking lot, suggesting possible struggle or surprise. They couldn't have imagined what microscopic evidence clung to that medical instrument, waiting for technology to catch up. Morrison submitted the stethoscope to the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory with a specific request. She wanted touch DNA analysis performed on every surface: the earpieces, the tubing, the chest piece, the metal components. The process required extraordinary care. Forensic technician Dr. James Chen spent hours in the laboratory, using sterile swabs to collect cellular material from areas where hands might have gripped the instrument. The results arrived 6 weeks later, and they were remarkable. The stethoscope yielded multiple DNA profiles. The primary profile, found most abundantly on the earpieces and chest piece, matched reference samples from Sarah Mitchell's preserved belongings. This was expected. She'd used this stethoscope daily for years. But a secondary profile emerged from the tubing near the chest piece, a small concentrated area suggesting someone had gripped the stethoscope firmly, likely during a struggle. This secondary DNA profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, a national database containing millions of genetic profiles. Within hours, the system produced a match. The profile belonged to someone already in the system, not from a criminal conviction, but from a voluntary submission made years earlier during an unrelated investigation. Detective Morrison stared at the name on her computer screen, reading it 3 times to ensure she wasn't misunderstanding. She pulled up the original case file, cross-referencing witness statements and interviews from 1982. Her hands began to tremble slightly as the implications crystallized. She reached for her phone and dialed her supervisor. "We need to reopen every piece of evidence from the Mitchell case," Morrison said, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "And we need to do it quietly, because the DNA on that stethoscope belongs to someone who's been part of this story from the very beginning." The cold case team worked methodically over the following weeks, building their case with the care such explosive findings demanded. They re-examined hospital security footage using modern enhancement software. They analyzed Sarah's work schedule and cross-referenced it with staff assignments. They obtained search warrants for decades-old employment records, and they interviewed people who'd worked at St. Vincent Hospital in 1982, asking questions informed by what they now knew. A pattern emerged, subtle enough that investigators in 1982 had missed it, but unmistakable through the lens of modern analysis. Sarah Mitchell's shift schedule had been modified 3 times in the month before her disappearance. Each modification moved her to later hours, eventually placing her on the Sunday evening shift that ended at 11:30 p.m. These schedule changes hadn't been requested by Sarah. They'd been authorized by hospital administration at the recommendation of the pediatric department chief. Records showed that Sarah had submitted a formal complaint to Hospital Human Resources on November 10, 1982, 4 days before she vanished. The complaint had been filed in a locked cabinet, reviewed by a single HR administrator who'd since died, and never made it into the police investigation because hospital officials in 1982 had deemed it unrelated to her disappearance. The complaint alleged financial irregularities in the pediatric department's budget, specifically questioning billing practices for procedures and medications. Sarah had documented instances where patient records showed treatments billed to insurance companies that she had no memory of administering. She'd noted discrepancies between medication logs and actual supplies. She'd begun quietly keeping her own records, comparing them against official documentation. Her complaint to HR represented the culmination of weeks of careful observation, and it named the person she believed responsible for what appeared to be systematic insurance fraud, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. That name was Dr. Robert Garrison. The man who had spent 42 years honoring Sarah Mitchell's memory had killed her to protect his secret. The man who established scholarships in her name had strangled her in a hospital parking lot to silence her questions. The man who comforted her grieving parents at annual vigils had looked them in the eyes for decades, knowing exactly where their daughter had gone and why she would never come home. Detective Morrison's investigation uncovered the systematic nature of Dr. Garrison's fraud. Between 1979 and 1982, he had created an elaborate billing scheme that exploited the trust inherent in pediatric medicine. Parents of sick children rarely questioned treatment recommendations from a respected physician. Insurance companies, overwhelmed with claims, conducted only cursory reviews of charges from established hospitals. Garrison had identified this vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. The scheme worked through careful manipulation of patient records. Garrison would order tests and procedures, document them in official charts, submit bills to insurance companies, but never actually perform many of the treatments. A chest X-ray billed but never taken. Respiratory therapy sessions charged but never administered. Medications prescribed and billed but never given to patients. The difference between what insurance paid and what the hospital actually spent flowed through a complex series of accounting transfers that eventually reached Garrison's control. Sarah Mitchell had noticed because she paid attention to details others overlooked. She remembered which children received which treatments. She tracked medication administration with meticulous care. When billing records showed procedures she knew hadn't occurred, She began investigating quietly, documenting discrepancies, building a case. Her complaint to Human Resources on November 10, 1982, represented the moment Garrison's carefully constructed fraud faced exposure. Hospital records, subpoenaed by Morrison's team, revealed that Garrison had learned about Sarah's HR complaint within hours of its filing. The HR administrator who reviewed it had mentioned it to Garrison during a routine meeting, not realizing the implications. The administrator later testified that Garrison had seemed concerned but not alarmed, promising to review the department's procedures and clarify any confusion in the records. Instead, Garrison began planning Sarah's murder. He had 4 days between learning of her complaint and the Sunday evening shift, when opportunity finally presented itself. Investigators analyzing his movements during that period discovered he had called in sick to a medical conference in Milwaukee that weekend, claiming a family emergency. No family emergency existed. He remained in Green Bay, waiting. The parking lot security footage, enhanced using modern video analysis software unavailable in 1982, revealed what investigators had missed for 4 decades. At 11:34 p.m., 2 minutes before Sarah exited the hospital, a figure emerged from shadows near the south entrance. The enhancement wasn't clear enough for facial identification, but body measurements and gait analysis matched Dr. Garrison's profile. The figure moved deliberately toward the area where Sarah's car was parked, then waited in darkness between vehicles. The stethoscope told the rest of the story. The DNA evidence suggested a violent struggle concentrated in a small area. Garrison had likely confronted Sarah as she approached her car. She'd been carrying her stethoscope, perhaps having just removed it after her shift. During the confrontation, Garrison grabbed it, trying to control her. Sarah fought back. The stethoscope fell to the asphalt, and somewhere in those desperate moments, Garrison overpowered the young nurse whose only crime had been noticing what wasn't supposed to be noticed. Garrison had been methodical in covering his tracks. He'd used his medical knowledge to avoid leaving obvious evidence. He'd transported Sarah's body in his own vehicle, a luxury sedan that aroused no suspicion in the hospital parking lot. He'd disposed of her remains in a location he'd clearly scouted in advance, somewhere isolated enough that discovery was unlikely. To this day, despite extensive searches following his arrest, Sarah Mitchell's body has never been recovered. Perhaps most chilling was how Garrison transformed himself into Sarah's public champion. By inserting himself into the investigation, organizing search efforts, comforting her family, he controlled the narrative. He directed attention away from himself while appearing above suspicion. Who would believe that the grieving mentor organizing vigils was actually the killer? Who would question the doctor establishing scholarships in her name? The disguise was perfect, because it relied on people's fundamental inability to believe that someone performing good deeds could harbor such darkness. For 42 years, Garrison lived this double life. He continued his medical career, eventually becoming chief of medicine at St. Vincent Hospital. He published research papers. He trained new doctors. He sat on hospital ethics committees. He attended Sarah Mitchell memorial events annually, his expression appropriately somber, his words carefully crafted to honor the woman he'd murdered. And every year, Sarah's parents thanked him for his dedication to their daughter's memory, never knowing they were shaking hands with her killer. On December 3, 2024, Detective Rachel Morrison and a team of federal agents arrived at Dr. Robert Garrison's home in suburban Green Bay at 6:47 a.m. The 70-year-old retired physician answered the door in a bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding as Morrison displayed her badge and arrest warrant. His wife of 40 years, Catherine Garrison, stood frozen in the hallway behind him, her face draining of color as Morrison read the charges. Murder in the first degree, insurance fraud, obstruction of justice. Garrison said nothing during the arrest. He set down his coffee carefully, extended his hands for the handcuffs, with the resigned cooperation of someone who'd always known this moment might eventually arrive, and walked silently to the unmarked vehicle waiting in his driveway. Neighbors emerged onto their porches, watching in stunned disbelief as one of their community's most respected figures was driven away in custody. The news detonated across Green Bay like a concussion wave. Dr. Robert Garrison, the man who dedicated decades to honoring Sarah Mitchell's memory, was accused of being her killer. The revelation wasn't just shocking, it was reality-shattering. How could someone perform such elaborate deception for 42 years? How could the comforter be the murderer? How could the public mourner be the private killer? St. Vincent Hospital released a statement expressing profound shock and grief, announcing that Garrison's employment records and all cases he'd overseen would undergo comprehensive review. The Sarah Mitchell Memorial Scholarship was immediately suspended, its existing funds placed in trust pending legal resolution. Recipients of the scholarship over 4 decades found themselves part of a narrative they'd never imagined, their nursing careers unwittingly connected to a killer's guilt management. Robert and Margaret Mitchell, now in their 90s, received the news in their Appleton home from Detective Morrison personally. Margaret wept, not with joy at the breakthrough, but with a complex grief that defied simple categorization. For 42 years, they'd trusted Garrison. He'd attended family dinners. He'd sent birthday cards. He'd been the one constant source of institutional support in their decades-long nightmare. The betrayal felt almost as devastating as the original loss. "He looked me in the eyes at every vigil," Margaret told reporters days later, her voice steady despite obvious pain. "He spoke about Sarah like he cared, like he missed her, and all along he knew. He knew what he'd done. He knew where she was, and he watched us suffer." She paused, gathering herself. "But now we finally know the truth. After 42 years of questions, we have answers. That's what we fought for all this time." The trial began in June 2025, drawing national media attention. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence from the stethoscope, the enhanced security footage, the employment records showing Garrison's access to schedule modifications, and the damning HR complaint Sarah had filed days before her death. They detailed the insurance fraud scheme, demonstrating motive through financial records showing Garrison had embezzled over $3 million during his career at St. Vincent Hospital. Former colleagues testified about Garrison's demeanor in the days after Sarah's disappearance, describing him as appropriately concerned, but not visibly distressed. Several recalled him volunteering to organize search efforts, taking a leadership role that now appeared calculatedly self-serving. The prosecution argued that Garrison had murdered Sarah to protect his fraud scheme, then constructed an elaborate public persona of grief to deflect suspicion while satisfying some psychological need to remain close to his crime. Garrison's defense attorneys argued that the DNA evidence could have innocent explanations, that Garrison had worked closely with Sarah and might have touched her stethoscope during routine medical activities. They challenged the enhanced video footage as too unclear for definitive identification. They suggested the HR complaint, while concerning, didn't prove murder, but the cumulative weight of evidence, the pattern of behavior, the decades of deception, proved insurmountable. On August 14, 2025, after 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Garrison, now 71 years old, showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Judge Patricia Simmons sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, her voice firm as she addressed the defendant directly. "You didn't just take Sarah Mitchell's life," Judge Simmons stated. "You stole 42 years of peace from her family. You corrupted her memory by pretending to honor it. You exploited the trust this community placed in you as a physician and as a human being. Your actions represent a betrayal so profound, it challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature. Sarah Mitchell's body has never been recovered, and Garrison has refused to disclose its location, despite multiple requests from prosecutors and the Mitchell family. This final act of control, withholding the one piece of information that might bring complete closure, demonstrates the depth of his narcissism even in defeat. If Sarah's story has moved you, please subscribe to Uncovered Crime Archive. Your support enables us to continue investigating cases like hers, stories that deserve to be told, families that deserve recognition for their perseverance. Share this video with someone who understands that justice delayed is not justice denied. Leave a comment about what aspect of this case impacted you most. Every subscription, every share, every comment helps ensure these stories reach the people who need to hear them. The Mitchell family attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, bearing witness to the truth they'd sought for more than 4 decades. Margaret Mitchell died peacefully in October 2025, 2 months after Garrison's conviction, finally able to rest, knowing her daughter's killer would spend his remaining years in prison. Robert Mitchell continues to advocate for cold case investigations, his daughter's case now serving as testament to the importance of preserving evidence and never abandoning hope. Some mysteries aren't meant to remain unsolved forever. Some truths simply wait for the right technology, the right investigator, the right moment when science catches up to secrets. Sarah Mitchell's case reminds us that justice, while sometimes unbearably delayed, can still arrive even after decades of darkness.